The controversial Keystone XL pipeline project, which would have carried oil from Canada to U.S. refineries on the Gulf Coast, has been rejected for now. The decision by President Obama is causing a political storm. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. The proposed $7 billion Keystone XL pipeline extension would have carried more than 700,000 barrels of crude oil per day from Canada to Texas. TransCanada, the company behind the project, first made the application in 2008. President Obama decided to hold off making a decision until after the 2012 election. But Republicans forced him to make a quicker decision. On Wednesday, the U.S. State Department rejected the application on the grounds that it couldn't be adequately reviewed within the 60-day deadline set by Congress. TransCanada says it will apply for a new permit to build along a similar route. So let's take a look at some of the arguments for and against the pipeline. Opponents object on environmental grounds, saying it would further America's dependence on dirty fuels and that would contribute to global warming and threaten ecological disaster. But supporters say it will create thousands of jobs. Most of these would be temporary construction work. And supporters say it will be good for energy security in that it will help wean the U.S. off Middle Eastern oil. So is the rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline plan a blow to energy security and job creation in the United States? And are environmental concerns really behind the decision by President Obama? Or is it just a political ploy? To answer these questions, we're joined by Damon Moglen, who's Climate and Energy Director at Friends of the Earth. From Stanford, California, we're joined by Jeremy Cole from the Hoover Institution, a think tank based at Stanford University. And also in the studio, we have William Yeatman, an energy policy analyst at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a public policy organization which is dedicated to advancing the principles of limited government, free enterprise and individual liberty. Welcome to all of you to the show. William Yeatman, let me start with you. Let's look at the politics of Obama's decision. Now, he was under pressure from the Republicans to make this decision very quickly. He has made that decision. Why do you think he's decided to reject the plan? Was it just born out of environmental concerns or was it simply a political move?
It certainly is politics. I will note it wasn't an unequivocal rejection. He practically invited TransCanada to reapply. So he did punt on this very decision last November, and this essentially was another punt until after the elections. He was in a bit of a pickle had he made a decision one way or the other. Had he approved the pipeline, he would have alienated environmentalists. Had he outright declined or disapproved the pipeline, he would have alienated the unions. Either way, he would have tempered or toned down the enthusiasm of a major element of his base heading into the 2012 election. So this way he kind of keeps them both, keeps the enthusiasm high and doesn't alienate either. It's the best possible political solution for the president. Okay,
Damon Moglen, I have a question for you, but first let's look at the proposed pipeline, which would cover more than 2,700 kilometers. That's from Canada to the U.S. state of Texas. Now, it starts from Canada's Alberta province, where the tar sands are situated. The pipeline enters the U.S. in the state of Montana and goes further down to Nebraska, where many have raised fears it will contaminate their main water source, the Ogolla Aquifer. The pipeline then goes further south, ending in Port Arthur and Houston. That's, of course, in the state of Texas. Is the president having it both ways here, saying, you know what, I'm going to reject this on environmental grounds, but, you know, as William Yeatman said, he's leaving it open. Reapply, and I might look at it after the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to realize, first of all, in rejecting the pipeline, the president and the State Department were very clear that not only were they rejecting the permit, they actually said that the pipeline is not in the national interest. And I think that's a very definitive statement. I actually think that if this is a punt, it's a punt right on out of the stadium. I think that it's a very decisive decision, and I think that the very forces that brought the president to this, the recognition of the environmental and public health impacts, are the ones that are going to block any future effort to build such a pipeline.
Let me stop you there. Is there a recognition on the part of the Obama administration on the effect this would have on the environment? Because his environmental record up to now has not been very good. I mean, if you look at what he's done just in the past year or so, I mean, he's failed to extend that moratorium on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. He's allowed drilling to take place off the Alaska coast in the Arctic. He's allowed drilling to take place in Montana, in South Dakota.
I think that to many who are concerned about the environment, the president has been far from satisfactory in the way that he's dealt with the environment, and I think that he needs to do far better. I think that this decision is one that has involved politics, clearly, but the fact is that over 3 years, hundreds of thousands of farmers, ranchers, folks across the country have been saying a pipeline like this that puts at risk the Ogallala Aquifer, which provides about water for about 1/3 of our agriculture around the United States, would be devastating. And I think that there is a recognition that the risks of the pipeline to the environment and the public health are a major factor here, and I think the president is responding to that.
Okay, let's bring in Jeremy Cole from Stanford out there in California. Jeremy, one of the arguments we hear from supporters is that, well, we hear thousands of jobs would be created, and the figures range from 5,000 to 250,000. That's just one of the arguments we hear, but essentially, what is the advantage for the United States in having this pipeline? Because as we looked at that map there, the U.S. is simply a transit point. It's the oil crude oil rather, coming from Canada, going to a port where it's going to be refined and exported.
Sure. I mean, I think it's absolutely true that what you have is a global oil market, and the sort of notions of what are called energy autarky, sort of the notion that we're going to kind of be entirely self-sufficient in our own energy, are not realistic. At the same time, Canada is a very friendly, very local potential supplier of energy to the U.S. I would say that I'd certainly bet more confidently on the future of the Canadian parliamentary system in 50 years than, say, the stability of the Saudi monarchy. And so I think from that perspective, there is some attractiveness from the energy security perspective, because just because you're exporting today doesn't mean that as global market conditions change, you have to export. Certainly we have assets, what we call stranded gas in the natural gas business, that can't be utilized at all. What this potentially does, or would have done, may still do if it gets approved under another guise, is give another alternate route of supply. And so from that perspective, I think the energy security concerns are relatively compelling. Obviously, there are some of the environmental concerns on the other end, and those were kind of well elaborated by the gentleman from Friends of the Earth.
Well, let's look at where the United States gets its oil from. Let's take a look at U.S. oil consumption and the amount that it imports. Now, the U.S. consumes nearly 19 million barrels of oil each day and imports more than 9 million barrels per day. Almost 50% of those imports are from the Americas. Canada is the leading supplier of crude and petroleum products, followed by Venezuela and Mexico. The U.S. gets nearly a quarter of its oil needs from Africa, mainly from Nigeria. The Persian Gulf accounts for another 18%, with Saudi Arabia being the dominant supplier. Other regions account for 10% of America's imported oil. So, William Yeatman, let me come back to you. Was the pipeline ever a part of U.S. energy policy?
Was it a part of U.S. energy policy? I mean, certainly it was. I mean, it was a private sector operation. It wasn't necessarily, unlike, say, green energy, which is wholly reliant, their existence, upon subsidies. This wasn't a government initiative. So to the extent that this is the private market satisfying demand for this essential product in this country, I don't think it was.
But it's not coming to this country. It's going to be exported.
Oh, well, again, but we do, as was mentioned by our colleague from Stanford, we participate in a global market for oil and for refined products. They're not exporting the oil per se, they're exporting the refined petroleum after it's gone through, it's been processed by our refining hub along the Gulf. So it's this notion of energy security, I don't really buy into that. I don't think there's much to that. As you noted, there's all sorts of jingoistic claims on kind of both sides of the aisle, impugning certain nations. But again, our top importer, our top exporter, from whence we receive most of our oil, the top importer would be Canada, our dear friends to the north, and most of it's coming from the Americas. We're participating in a global market for a product we need. That's a good thing. The alternatives are more expensive. So is it a government policy? No, this is a private sector action. Does it advance energy security? I don't really buy into that notion. It further buttresses and improves this global market for this essential good. That's a good thing.
Damon, what do you make of those two arguments? Firstly, sources of energy, the U.S. lessening its dependence on certain sources of oil, and also the jobs argument.
Well, I think on the energy side, I think that this is clearly not part of U.S. energy policy. I think the fact of the matter, as you point out, is that this was petroleum that was to be transiting the United States. So in effect, the real issue here was profits for the Canadian oil company TransCanada. And as compared with those, I think those are why the environmental and public health issues that were raised by the millions of people who were in hearings and testified, who were concerned about public health and the environment in this country, that was a question of national policy. As to jobs, I think it's no surprise that the job numbers that are being put forward by TransCanada are completely inflated. They're extraordinarily inflated. In fact, the only independent job study that's been done was done at Cornell, and it shows that as few as 50 permanent jobs might actually be created by the pipeline. Otherwise, what we're talking about is temporary jobs along the pipeline route. Now, of course, temporary jobs are very important in our country, but what we also saw is you have a massive oil spill like you have in the Gulf, you are going to lose an extraordinary number of jobs. And that's why farmers and ranchers across the United States said, we don't want this pipeline because it endangers our very well-being. And I think that's, again, why it was in the national interest to reject the pipeline.
Jeremy Cole,
I think that's being a little bit naive to the politics. I mean, if you look at some of the people who are really opposing this, who had money, and I'm not suggesting these guys are the folks who are supporting Friends of the Earth message, which I fully believe they believe wholeheartedly. It was competitive refiners, it was Nigerian and Venezuelan interests. I mean, there are a lot of business interests on either side of this that are separate from the environmental merits. And I kind of feel like, from my perspective, the reason why I was disappointed in this, even as someone who's not been critical of everything the Obama administration has done in energy and certainly in alternative energy, I was disappointed because I do think it was just kind of a political decision, and the correct comparative alternative is not doing this. Canada is going to do this. That's where the environmental argument should be made about whether or not this is smart. We can't compare this to leprechauns and fairies. We have to compare this to a reality, which is that otherwise this oil is likely to wind up in China. And what are the environmental potential implications of that and the security implications of that? I think too many of the analyses that have been critical of that don't look at that comparative. And so I'd be a little bit critical from that perspective.
Damon, you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that the reason that the pipeline was to run across the United States was because they can't get it to run across Canada right now. The environmental situation in Canada is that the Indigenous community and folks across the west of Canada have been blocking the building of a Canadian pipeline to take it there. So I really do beg to differ entirely. This is very much about the future of tar sands oil. And I think that as a decisive decision coming from the president, we may be seeing the movement towards blocking the production of tar sands oil, which is going to be an absolutely critical thing if we are going to address climate change. Because as James Hansen has said, we go ahead with tar sands oil, it's a time bomb for the climate. So that's also the bigger picture of this issue.
Okay, let's look at the political situation. It's of course become a campaign issue. We're hearing it now on the Republican side. We're also hearing it from the White House as well. Let's listen to what one of the top Republican leaders in the U.S. House had to say about President Obama's decision.
President Obama is destroying tens of thousands of American jobs and shipping American energy security to the Chinese. There's really just no other way to put it. The president is selling out American jobs for politics.
William Yeatman, listening there to John Boehner, the president might have tried to kick the can down the road by making this decision and saying, look, okay, we'll carry out another study and then we'll look at the new application, and that's going to take 12 to 18 months. That's going to be well past the election. But we can hear from what John Boehner is saying, the Republicans in Congress are going to keep this in the public domain.
Indeed. I mentioned at the outset that this was decent politics for the president. I believe it's great politics for the president's opponents. The president acted to mollify his base. These issues, however, especially these of fuel prices, increasing our supply of fuel, and shovel-ready jobs, I mean, that's very important. The job numbers are disputed. They're all over the board, but the consensus seems to be somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 jobs over a 2-year period. I mean, that's a significant amount of shovel-ready jobs. It wouldn't require a penny of government investment. So, yes, Boehner's press conference indicated today that they will do everything in their power to keep this issue in the limelight, probably by doing what they did last month, which is to tether a decision on the Keystone Pipeline to a legislative priority for the president, and thereby kind of keep who knows how they'll proceed, but perhaps every 2 months or so, every 60 days or so, forcing the president to again make this very uncomfortable decision.
Jeremy Cole, is the president between a rock and a hard place here? Because, you know, in making this decision, he may have satisfied one of his constituencies, which is the environmental lobby, but I think he's upset another important constituency, which are the labor unions.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately this was another example of the President Obama voting present, you know, as we saw in the state legislature back in Illinois. And I actually honestly would have respected the decision more while not necessarily agreeing with it if he'd just taken the Friends of the Earth position and just said, look, this is very destructive from a greenhouse gas perspective. I think that the climate concerns and the other environmental concerns, the aquifer concerns, are just such that we're not going to do this, and it's not in our interest, and be very definitive about it. And again, what he's really tried to do is have it both ways. He is a little bit between a rock and a hard place, but I think he really has not shown leadership on this issue. I think the fact that my other two colleagues here sort of are parsing his decision differently in terms of its implications are indicative of the fact that he's really just kicked the can down the road toward past the election, and I personally don't really think that shows a lot of leadership.
Damon, there are some in the environmental community who say that this could be a turning point, this decision. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, I think it may prove to be a truly iconic decision. I think that if what this amounts to is a reflection about governmental policy being to say no to tar sands production, and that we see, as my colleague was saying, that we see the president actually inhabiting a more bold position on climate change, which he has said is the environmental issue of our era. If we begin to realize that certain kinds of energy are simply too dirty to move ahead with, this would be a hugely important decision, and certainly myself and many of my colleagues in the environmental community intend to make it that decision.
Okay, William, I want you to respond to what Damon's saying, but first, let's look at President Obama's policy on energy. He's been calling for increasing domestic oil production to reduce dependence on imports. Let's listen to what he said last May.
We should increase safe and responsible oil production here at home. Last year, America's oil production reached its highest level since 2003, but I believe that we should continue to expand oil production in America, even as we increase safety and environmental standards.
Okay, William.
Well, I think what we've got here is a difference between words and actions. That statistic he just cited, that we've got the highest levels of energy production since 2003, that's because of the back-end fields in Montana primarily. I'm sorry, North Dakota, I'm sorry. And the reason that there's been an explosion in oil and gas production in that state that has indeed that has resulted in that very number, that statistic, is because it's on private lands. The government wasn't able to get in the way and to muck it up. And elsewhere, so in federal lands along the Rockies and in deep water drilling in the Gulf, off the Gulf Coast, we're seeing bureaucratic foot dragging of the sort that is inimical, that is inhibiting oil and gas production. So that stat is due to the fact that the government couldn't muck it up. So when he claims that indeed the government is pursuing energy production, oil and gas production, and energy security for whatever that's worth, the facts belie that claim.
Jeremy Cole, one of the major complaints we hear about, you know, when it comes to energy against this administration is that it does not have a comprehensive energy policy. It's just piecemeal. It's made up as it goes along. It's just on an ad hoc basis.
Well, I think that's fair. I mean, I do think that there's some significant vision, kind of at least at a theoretical level. I mean, you know, if you talk to Steve Chu, who's you know, was formerly at Stanford for a number of years, and who a number of folks here know quite well. I mean, he is a guy who has a certain vision. I guess a little bit of my criticism of that vision has been that it has been sort of an either-or and not enough of a yes-and vision in anything but rhetoric, which is, I think, that it's great that we are trying to do more R&D, and I would love to see, in fact, more sustained basic science R&D, not the sort of cylindric giveaways, but sort of, I do think that basic scientific research at a fundamental level is something the government can really contribute to in energy policy and really kind of seed the ground for then private capital to take over. So I think we have seen some good, some bad there, but I don't think that we've seen kind of similar vision in the fossil space, and I think there's a great kind of constitutional reluctance to look at fossil energy as a component, not just of this, which is certainly among the dirtier fossil energy out there, whatever its security components, but I think, you know, some dragging of feet on shale gas and some other things that I think most people think could at least serve as a bridge fuel to a cleaner energy future at the very least, if not a fairly permanent solution, depending on one's political views.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the president's energy policies that environmental groups have criticized. Now, in November 2011, the administration said it planned to sell drilling leases for 15 new areas. It's imposed a ban on new offshore permits in 2010 after the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, only to lift it 6 months later. Obama has failed to deliver on his campaign promise to implement a cap-and-trade system to reduce carbon emissions. Obama's also been encouraging the use of natural gases for electricity and transport, but its chief component, methane, is a potent greenhouse gas. Damon, the absence of a comprehensive energy policy here, I mean, the president talks about increasing domestic supplies, reducing imports of oil. He's not talking about alternative sources of energy, developing alternative means to run our vehicles around the country.
That's right. I mean, it's really sad, because what we should have is a visionary situation. As my colleague was talking about, Mr. Chu, the secretary, this is an extraordinary, smart, visionary person, and yet we do not have a visionary energy policy at all. Here we are talking about basically oil, petroleum, and yet we do not have a government that's talking about the fact that this is a commodity we're going to run out of, and in the meantime we're going to have catastrophic climate change if we don't get it under control. Why are we not talking about hybrid electric and ultimately completely electric cars running off of solar energy? That's not pie in the sky. That's a reality. And we need to get there. Ultimately, we have to get there. And the only way to get there is if we start. And we need to start now. And I think that's the kind of situation we'd like to now be hearing is no to pipelines of this nature, no to tar sands, but we need to start talking about really clean, cutting-edge technology of the 21st century.
William Yeatman, is that going to happen, or is, not just this administration, but the next one and the one after it, are they just going to simply cave in to big oil?
Caving into big oil. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I will note there has been a vision at play here. I mean, we're spending scores of billions of dollars. I believe it was $67 billion in the 2009 stimulus on green energy. So that's a fairly profound policy right there. It was Bloomberg New Energy Finance reported just this week that the United States has overtaken China as the world's most reckless energy investor, if I may say. On these green jobs, on these green energy technologies. And that's in effect picking and choosing winners in the energy industry. So to the extent that there is a vision, it's just that. It is showering politically favored industries, green energy industries, with subsidies and taxpayer largesse.
Jeremy Carl.
And that is a concern.
Go ahead.
That is a concern that I have as well, if I could just jump in really quickly here, which is that I think there's been too much conflation by this administration of energy policy and jobs policy and economic policy. And those are three very separate components, and a lot of this kind of green jobs rhetoric. And I mean, we're right out here in the kind of centerpiece of energy innovation out here in the Valley. And so it's not that I want to discourage that, but I think there's been a lot too much happy talk about kind of green jobs and the what makes a sensible energy policy, even from a climate or green perspective, is not necessarily the same thing that is a good jobs policy, that may not be the same thing as a stimulus policy. And I think that is an area in which the administration has been very disappointing in my view. I think we need to back off of some of these political favors and kind of politically favored industry in favor of an approach that much more favors the sort of fundamental R&D that would really move us forward.
One other question, Jeremy, and that is energy security versus energy self-sufficiency. Is there a difference there?
I think there is, and I'm probably not quite as much of a skeptic as my colleague from the Competitive Enterprise Institute on the whole notion of energy security. I think it's certainly overblown, but I do think that it exists. And I mean, if you look at the Arab oil embargo of 1973, that had an actual effect. The market sort of stopped running in the way that it had been. So I do think that it can be real, and I think to the extent that we can get oil and have at least the reliable option of supply from countries that are favorable to us and that we get along with well, that's generally a good thing. On the other hand, this is a global market. It's a global market for oil, and it's a global market for many of the energy commodities we are. And so we shouldn't have any sort of illusion that in the short term what we're going to be doing is getting more American oil. Much of this, in fact, will go to export, and it's not going to bring down the price of oil $30 a barrel in the U.S. by itself. It's going to be a small incremental change, and that has to be evaluated against environment and jobs and everything else, and that's something that Canada has to do, and that's something the U.S. has to do.
And that is where we are going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. That's it from the team in Washington. Thanks to all of you for being on the show today. We want to hear from you, of course. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. You can send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.